it's a pleasure for me to be associated with this particular event, where there has been an in-depth analysis of the education policy that has been suggested, and that too by a very distinguished scholar. I have unfortunately not been able to read the book properly because I think it was released only yesterday. To me, what was sent was an advanced copy by email, which I have glanced through, but I don't feel competent to talk about the book as such. I shall refer to points in the book from time to time, but let me say a little bit in general about the education policy that has been, the draft education policy that is now being discussed. Basically, when Gandhiji launched his civil disobedience movement, he asked students in school, in colleges, universities and so on, to give up their education and to come out. In justification for this, he said that the education that was being given to them in the English colleges and universities, English-started colleges and universities, is something which was basically meant to prepare them to be servitors of the British Raj. That kind of education is something that they better do without. Rather, what he wanted was education which would produce people who, in my language, which I borrow from Antonio Gramsci, would produce organic intellectuals of free India. And he felt that the kind of educational institutions that existed at the time were intrinsically incapable of producing the organic intellectuals of free India, which is why he wanted them to come out of it. Now, obviously, it is implicit in what Gandhiji said that education is not a homogeneous thing. You cannot just say that there is something called education which is being given irrespective of what institutions we are talking about, irrespective of what context we are talking about, and so on. Obviously, the kind of education which needs to be imparted, which is imparted in the social interest at any point of time, is something which changes from one point of time to another. Now, this has several implications. Obviously, one implication is that the education which is imparted in India cannot simply be a replica of the education that is imparted, say, in a university like Harvard or Cambridge or anything. That basically, if you have an educational institution here, that educational institution cannot just be a clone of the educational institution that may be in the United States or in Britain or anything of that kind. I'll give you an example. For instance, I believe in my subject, economics, every Indian student should know a little bit about our own economic history. Therefore, should know something about colonialism, and therefore should know something about, let's say, a man called Dadabhai Naoroji, who wrote about colonialism. But on the other hand, you go to Harvard, nobody would have heard of Dadabhai Naoroji. You go to Cambridge, nobody would have heard of Dadabhai Naoroji. So if you have a curriculum which simply replicates what is being taught in the advanced capitalist countries in an education institution in India, in that case one is doing a fundamental disservice to the Indian society. Now, there is a second implication of what Gandhiji had in mind, and that implication is that the educational institutions must not produce self-centered, self-absorbed, self-obsessed bourgeois individuals, because bourgeois individuals are supposed to be basically looking after their own interests, but the purpose of the education system should be to produce people who are sensitive to their environment, who are sensitive to the society in which they live, who are sensitive to the people, to the needs of that society in which they live. If this is the case, then we should have a set of educational institutions which are very different, which are sui generis, which are completely specific to the kind of requirements that we have. If they're going to produce the organic intellectuals of free India, if they're going to produce intellectuals for free India, which no matter what their discipline, which no matter whether they are scientists or social scientists or specialists in humanities, would nonetheless be having certain common characteristics of being socially sensitive, should be having some common characteristics of prizing the freedom of their people above anything else and defending that freedom above anything else. Now, if this is the purpose, then we should be clear that this idea, which informed in some ways, very imperfect ways, the setting up of the educational system after independence, at least this was the thinking which underlay the setting up of the educational system after independence, is something which is under attack today. It is under attack from two distinct directions. One is the direction of international capital. International capital would like our educational institutions basically to produce cannon fodder for its own profit-making machinery. And therefore, it is interested in the commoditization of education. Education should actually be a commodity, because the people coming out of the education system, themselves being commodities who go to the highest bidders and who think of nothing else but their own selves, and they measure their own worth in terms of the money that they command in the market, which is the meaning of a commodity, that basically if the products of the education system are a commodity, are commodities, then the education that goes into them, the education that is embodied in them, should also be inevitably become a commodity. Therefore, we have on the one hand a threat to the production of organic intellectuals of free India, which comes from international capital. International capital is interested in the skills you have. International capital is not interested in the thoughts you have. Therefore, the first challenge to the production of organic intellectuals of a free India arises from the side of international capital that would rather destroy thought in order to produce skills. The second kind of challenge comes from the Hindutva forces. The project of the Hindutva forces, creating a Hindu state, requires a whole lot of an ideological structure, an entire ideological structure, for instance, which blames the minority, which blames the hapless minority, the Muslims, for the ills of contemporary India. And it does, for it to do so, it must be the case that people must be willing to accept it. Now, if people are unwilling to accept it, in that case the Hindutva project gets stalled. Therefore, for the advancement of the Hindutva project, you require a destruction of thought. You require a destruction of reason, which is why at the moment there are all these attacks on institutions of higher learning. That if you take Jawaharlal Nehru University, my own university, if you take Hyderabad Central University, if you take Pune Film Institute, just name any distinguished place, any distinguished center of learning today is under attack. Why? Because the Hindutva project requires a destruction of thought. It requires a destruction of reason. It requires the promotion of unreason, where people do not believe in, or do not insist upon evidence before accepting propositions. Therefore, the project of developing an education system which would cater to the need to produce organic intellectuals of a free India faces today a twin challenge. One is from the side of international capital, which through the process of globalization is seriously interfering in our education system. The other is from the side of Hindutva, which is in the process of attacking all the institutions that have been set up since independence, which are worth something. Now, this corporate Hindutva project of trying to destroy thought is something which is now being given an official imprimatur in this draft National Education Committee report. This National Education Committee report is something which carries forward that particular idea of really, the corporate Hindutva project of destruction of thought, destruction of reason, destruction of or destruction of the project of developing organic intellectuals of a free India. Now, how does it do? There are many different aspects, many different ways in which it does so. One very obvious way, which has attracted a lot of attention in Tamil Nadu, is of course its language policy. Now, while it says that the objective of promoting Hindi is to replace English by Hindi, to replace the monopoly of an English-speaking elite by Hindi, really speaking, the introduction of Hindi would be at the expense of all the different regional languages, not so much English, because when you look at it carefully, they say, well, when it comes to science will have to be done in English. It is true that in science, for local newspapers and so on, science popularization can be done in different languages, but science has to be done in English. Much the same can be said about other subjects and so on. So see, the effort is not really a serious assault or a serious substitution of English by your own language. That, by the way, is something which one of the most distinguished physicists in India, Satyen Bose, for instance, used to believe that physics must be taught in Bengali, because of the fact that a student has much greater capacity and an ability to relate concepts to his own kind of surroundings if those concepts are expressed in the regional language. But as I said, behind a facade of replacing English by Hindi, there is in fact the actual project of replacing all kinds of regional languages by Hindi. Now, this is again a part of the Hindutva project. If you look at contemporary India, every Indian is imbued with a dual national consciousness, which developed in the course of the anti-colonial struggle. One is the consciousness which is a pan-Indian consciousness. There is a certain, we are Indians, there is a certain pan-Indian consciousness, and the other is a consciousness which is much older, which actually goes back to the Bhakti movement and so on, where we actually talk in terms of I'm a Tamil, I'm an Odia, I'm a Bengali, I'm an Assamese and so on. So every Indian, and the pan-Indian consciousness developed essentially in the period of the anti-colonial struggle. Even the other consciousness got a big fillip in the period of anti-colonial struggle, though its origins go back earlier. So every modern Indian has a certain dual national consciousness. Our federal structure is supposed to reflect that dual national consciousness, and of course this dual national consciousness is reflected above all in the fact that our regional linguistic groups, therefore language is crucial in the formation of that consciousness, is something which is respected when we look at our federal structure. But the Constitution insisted upon providing a federal structure so that this dual national consciousness has its counterpart in terms of a center on the one hand and states on the other. Now you find that the tremendous centralization which has taken place of late, one tax Earlier, states had a right to levy taxes and the like, no longer. One tax, GST. Education, which used to be a subject in which the states had a big say, is now more or less completely centralized. So, this idea of one language is a part of the same phenomenon. So, one leader, one party, one language, opposition Mukta Bharat, one leader, one party, one language is all a part of the project of Hindutva nationalism, if you call it nationalism, or if you like the Hindutva ideology. And that is something which gets reflected in this report. This report also, in terms of a number of its specific discussions, echoes the Hindutva mindset. For instance, it talks about prominent Indians whose lives must be introduced to every Indian student. Now, among these is Swami Vivekananda, but not Jawaharlal Nehru, conspicuously missing. Now, I wonder how a scientist like Kasturi Rangan, who's actually supposed to be a very well-known scientist, distinguished scientist, can actually draw up a list of distinguished Indians where Jawaharlal Nehru's name is completely missing. Likewise, you have other instances, important topics on which every Indian should actually have a certain knowledge. Those topics include Swachh Bharat, but they don't include the caste system. In other words, it's not necessary for you to know about the millennia of atrocious social oppression that has been carried out in this country, but on the other hand, you must know about Swachh Bharat. Now, the thing is that that this is at the same time the fact that this can come into a report of this kind is suggestive either of the fact that the authors of the report themselves subscribe to this ideology or are really kowtowing to the ruling ideology of this particular time. But suppose we go beyond this. Let's look at the content of the report. When you say, I mean, there's a Russian saying that what is cooked in the kitchen is not decided in the kitchen. Whatever happens in education today is not decided in the sphere of education. It's actually a part of the overall economic policy. It's a part of the way that the entire economy is functioning. Now, if the project of producing the organic intellectual of the people of free India was really on, then that project essentially must be the province of the state. To fulfill that project, education must be a state responsibility. Therefore, one would have expected a report of this kind which tries to really look at what should be done in the sphere of education, to emphasize that the state should play a major role in education. Now, the report does say that the state should raise its expenditure on education from 10% to 20%, but say absolutely no idea of how this can be financed. How do you raise from 10 to 20%? If it is the case that these funds have to be generated, in that case, you need to tax, and the obvious means of taxing is through wealth taxation. Because in India there is virtually no wealth taxation, and as we all know, as we read in the papers, wealth inequalities are increasing by leaps and bounds. They're phenomenal at this moment. Really, India is one of the most wealth unequal societies in the world. Not a word on wealth taxation, not a word on how exactly the resources can be raised, so that rising of the government's budget from 10 to 20% is just a kind of throwaway line. On the other hand, the report does talk about substantial increase in private institutions. It talks, of course, about private institutions which are philanthropic institutions, but it says that it mentions no need for making any attempt to control the fee structure in the in these philanthropic institutions, supposedly philanthropic institutions. The Kerala government, when Comrade M.A. Baby was the education minister, had tried to do that. Unfortunately, Kerala happens to be a state in which many of these institutions are run by a religious minority, the Christians, and because of that it fell foul of the courts and it could not be done. But no serious attempt has been made to control the fee structure in these private institutions to date. And if that is the case, then obviously they're going to exclude large numbers of the deprived socially as well as economically. Then it talks about the context. I was talking on the context. It talks about the education system without the context. It talks about early care. It talks about the Anganwadis. But it does not mention that the Anganwadi workers are among the worst paid in the country. They are not recognized even as government employees. And therefore, you talk about early care, but you don't talk about Anganwadi workers improving their status and so on. So it talks about an education policy which is devoid of the context. Large numbers of universities in India are actually now extremely understaffed. They actually run with the help of, all these ad hoc teachers who give courses and so on, and I wherever I go, I try to collect some information about how much they get in terms of salary, and it turns out that they are among the worst paid. The state I come from, Orissa, once I was in a UGC committee and we were interviewing various departments. I do economics, so we were interviewing the economics department whether some fund should be made available to it. And from Odisha, the economics department of a particular university, which I shall not name, that came, we asked them, so what programs do you run? They said MA, MPhil, PhD. And we asked them, how many faculty members do you have? They said, we have 3 faculty members. Can you imagine running an MA, MPhil and PhD program with 3 faculty members? So we asked, how do you manage? They said, well, we sometimes get people to come and teach from outside. Otherwise, we ask the students to read on their own. Now, if that is the situation, then to talk about excellence without talking about increasing staff strength, without talking about enlarging the faculty size in most of these universities is something which is really a travesty. And what is more, say even in Calcutta, even in the city of Calcutta, people give lectures in various educational institutions for a pittance, which also violates, by the way, the constitutional principle of equal pay for equal work. Because if you are permanent, then you get a much higher salary. If you are ad hoc, then you are paid a pittance. Now, without going into that, again to talk about education policy makes no sense whatsoever. But not only is it that in these specific respects the report is lacking, that it misses the context, it actually conforms to a certain notion of Hindutva centralization. But even when you look at even when you look at the kind of specific recommendations it makes, that those recommendations betray a mindset which I believe is destructive of the education system. 1. In the matter of faculty recruitment, it actually says that it mentions no reservations in faculty recruitment. No reservations. In other words, now, for instance, you would have a certain amount of reservations which is given to Dalits or OBCs or something, but none of that is mentioned. It is on the contrary, the report talks about faculty recruitment being entirely based upon, in quotes, excellence. Now, I want to just destroy this notion of excellence that is talked about. There is a feeling, whenever we talk about reservation, whenever we talk about affirmative action, that there is a feeling that a trade-off is being made between equity and quality. That actually, that equity demands that there should be some reservation, but quality, of course, would suffer, but we should be willing to put up with some going down of quality for the sake of equity. This, by the way, is believed even by many who are really for reservations. I believe this is completely wrong. The argument of there being a conflict between equity and quality is a bogus argument. If talent is more or less evenly distributed across various population groups, in that case, you should normally be expecting to have in, let's say, a particular sample, let's say teachers, university teachers, the same proportional representation as the different groups enjoy in society. In other words, if you have half upper caste and half lower caste, that should roughly also be reflected in the composition of teachers. So, if you do not have that, then effectively you are substituting a substandard upper caste for a potentially excellent lower caste. In other words, if talent is evenly distributed across society, and that being the case, both equity and quality demand that there be some reservations in order to overcome what I call barriers to entry. Economists talk in other barriers to entry. So, in order to overcome the barriers to entry, you need to, in fact, have both reservations, both for quality as well as equity. There is no conflict between the two. It's true that when you have recruited because of the inherited lack of because of the inherited handicaps of many who would be recruited under the reservations, you'd need to have bridge courses, you'd need to have some kind of preparation. But that's a very separate issue from the fact that there has to be a composition of, let's say, teachers which is similar to that which you find in society. Now, but if you say that no, we go only for excellence, in that case you are prioritizing existing privilege over potential excellence. Because existing privilege implies that only some people who have access to education, who are better off, who have got a certain intellectual and cultural capital in terms of being born into a kind of family that has had access to education for decades, would be prioritized over potential for excellence, which would be there but which would be getting excluded. But this is what the report does. It's a very Brahminical report in that sense. The second aspect which you find in this particular report, which is again of note, is that it says that teachers, now we have a system of merit promotion. We have a system of promotion. After a certain number of years, teachers get a chance to come up whether they are posts or not. It says that all such schemes must be done away with. All appointments and therefore promotions should be based entirely on the basis of, in quotes, excellence, quality of work. Now, I think the idea that material betterment is something, or material improvement in your condition of life is the only way of promoting excellence in academic research is a bogus idea. For instance, if you do this, then there will be many senior teachers who would not be getting promoted and would remain bitter, discontented. On the other hand, many young persons who get quick promotions because they are published, networking, and they have got publication in all kinds of foreign journals, would be getting quickly promoted to professorships and such like. Therefore, you would find universities or colleges, people with two kinds of persons. One, a disgruntled element, and the other is one which is kind of, rapidly rising whippersnappers, whose objective, by the way, would be not to stay on in India but to migrate abroad. Because if it is the case that you are doing so well that you have become a professor at the age of 25 or 30, in that case the idea would be that then you try and be a professor in Australia or somewhere and then migrate to the United States. So the thing is that it would be therefore destructive of collegiality within the education system. It would be destructive of the entire motivation that people have for teaching, because there will be one lot who are disgruntled, who have very little motivation because they are disgruntled. There's another lot which is forever looking over their shoulders about what kind of opportunities are arising in the foreign countries. Therefore, far from this being a panacea for improving the education system, this would actually destroy the education system. Now, there is a lot of talk in this report about multidisciplinarity and so on. Now, obviously, I come from JNU where multidisciplinarity is highly prized, so you get quite excited, multidisciplinarity, very good and so on. But when you look at it closely, multidisciplinarity in this report simply refers to the fact that no matter what you are doing, no matter which subject you are doing, you must get an inkling of the greatness of India, which basically also means the greatness of Hindu India. That, we developed the Pythagoras theorem here, we developed the Fibonacci series here, we developed everything here. And that you should be, and we had Kautilya's Arthashastra. So the whole idea would be not that a student, let's say doing sciences, must have an idea of contemporary developments in economics, contemporary developments in sociology or in political science or in philosophy, but must actually be introduced to the greatness of the Indian philosophical tradition, to the greatness of the Indian economics tradition and so on. So it's just a way of celebrating India's so-called glorious past, with references to caste system and so on systematically removed from it, and on the one hand that, and on the other hand, as it very clearly says, that the idea behind this is to produce people for the so-called knowledge economy. Now, people for the knowledge economy essentially means producing people who are, so many $1 trillion of an economy and so on. Producing people who are essentially possess skills, but not knowledge, not sympathy, not empathy for the poor, and not therefore the kind of social sensitivity that Gandhiji had wanted when he was talking, in my language, of producing the organic intellectuals of the people of a free India. So what you have here is a reflection, couched of course in language which is far more sophisticated, but a reflection of the same project, carrying forward this same project, giving it an official imprimatur, and that project is the corporate Hindutva project of destruction of thought, destruction of reason, substitution of skills for knowledge, and of course destruction of the project of building the organic intellectuals of the people of free India. Thank you.